This is Damian Macy, and it is Wednesday, May the 13th of 2015, and I'm at the lovely home of Janet and Dudley Crow, and I'm interviewing Janet for our Marshall Public Library, Friends of the Library, Oral History Project. And today, I'm going to introduce you to Janet. Janet, you're on.
Okay, thank you, Damian. I grew up as Janet Sue Huffington, and I was daughter of Elsie and Jack Huffington. I was born in Marshall in 1946 and lived in Marshall most of the time until I graduated from high school. Dad had a job in Fort Knox, so we were away from the community just a couple of early years, but moved back, and this was home. And I went to the North Side School and West Junior High. West Junior High. I'm bringing Lawrence, Kansas back into it. Went to the junior high school here and then to Marshall High. And it was a wonderful time of growing up. As you look back on it now, it kind of seemed like a fantasy land compared to what the children had. You know, you could play kick the can after dark, and your parents didn't have to be in every corner to make sure everything was okay. Could walk to school. I remember walking to school during ice storms when it was hard even to get across the street. We lived on 614 North 6th Street, and I believe that's a house number. That house has just been redone. Milo Pierce had bought it.
Okay.
At the time we sold it.
So yes.
Okay. And crossing 6th Street during an ice storm when you're walking to North School was kind of tricky, but it was too dangerous to drive, so the kids that could get there walked on the ice. And
you did go to the old North Side School.
To the old North Side School. And walked by the house that Stanfield's had, Reed have it now, and had the wrought iron fence, and I can remember rubbing my hand along that wrought iron fence as I walked to Northside School and eating persimmons when they were ripe, and I knew not to eat them unless they were really squishy. But it was just a wonderful time of growing up, and anybody's mom or dad could tell you that you were misbehaving and you needed to straighten up, and you knew you needed to because your folks were going to hear about it before you got home. So, but that was good. I always felt like my dad was omnipresent. I think the first week I was in high school, I rounded a corridor and my dad was in the hallway, and I thought, even in high school. So
news traveled faster then than with the cell phones today.
It certainly did. But Mother and Dad were very involved in our growing up. We attended First Methodist Church, and that was a very big part of our heritage. It's First United Methodist Church now, I guess. But Dad was Sunday school superintendent, and Mother taught kindergarten there for a long time in the Methodist Church. I don't ever remember, maybe I ought to talk about where we lived. We lived on North 6th Street, and then as we started into junior high, and I was about ready to start into junior high when I could just walk a block and a half to school, and Dad decided he was going to take his 4 daughters to the country. So we moved west of town and bought the house out west of town, and that's where we grew up during junior high and high school, and don't ever remember asking to have friends out when Mother and Dad said no. We had the room to entertain, and they always felt like if they were entertaining there, they knew where we were.
Now that is the house where Ann Cooper lives now.
It is the house where Ann Cooper lives now. It was a big house. We did some renovating. Of course, Ann's done a lot more since that time, but it was a wonderful place to be. When it snowed, you had sledding parties. There was a room we used to call the East Room, and there was a grill there, and Dad was always ready to cook hamburgers for anybody, and there was always hot chocolate flowing. And as I look back, I wonder how they did everything that they did and still were ready for us to have parties anytime. And of course, with snow, it was at the moment's notice. The friends all used the front hill for sledding, But when it was just family, we got to use the back hill that went down all the way to almost to the barn, and then Dad would bring us up the hill with a loader, and we'd slide down the hill. You can't see it from the street or from the road, but it was a big hill. It was.
And I'm trying to think of the name of, was that Ernestine Meyer's?
Ernestine Meyer's home. Yes, it was. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's what I thought.
In fact, at the time we bought it, we were told that the redbud tree west of the house was kind of sacred because Grandma's ashes were under it. Now, I don't think the redbud tree's there anymore, but there was a redbud tree just west of the house, and of course, to children, that was kind of an interesting place to play, knowing there were ashes there. And then there was a rock garden that sprung up from it. And after I was married, I actually lived in the cottage a couple summers. We would come back during summers. And my first husband was Gary Price, and he was a teacher. So in the summertime, we could come back to Marshall, and he took some courses at Indiana State. And so when I graduated from high school, I don't know how detailed you want me to be as I go up. Okay. I think I'll talk a little bit more about school, though, because those high school years were very, very formative years. And as I look at children now that perhaps aren't as involved in high school, they go for the classwork and other things. I mentioned the church. MYF was very important to us. I was actually president of the district MYF at one time while I was in high school. Job's Daughters was important. Masonic organizations. Mother and Dad didn't do as much with Eastern Star. Dad was very involved in Shrine, but Job's Daughters to me, growing up, that was very important. You got to know girls that you may not have been close friends with in high school, at the school, but in Job's Daughters you were a family, and you all kind of pulled together. It let me do memory work, and that became important to me as I was involved in speech contests in high school, and things that I wouldn't have thought about doing in high school. Job's Daughters gave me the confidence to go forward and do that. Of course, teachers in high school, Priscilla Wyke, was very important to me. She helped also give me the confidence to go forward in speech work. And I didn't realize until I became a professional and was asked to speak that it was really the basis for any talking that I did. And that went back to the foundations that she gave me in speech and through drama and the other activities. Bob Morse was another favorite teacher. Of course, we just lost Bob a couple of years ago. I didn't know Bob outside of high school. I know some of the girls from town babysat for him, and so got to know the family that way. I just knew him in the classroom, and he was somebody that you could have fun with in class, but you knew where the boundaries were, and he taught me math.
The homework done.
Yes, he taught me math. And when I got ready to go to college, he told me, now if you ever have any math classes that you have problems with, you let me know and I'll help you.
Uh-huh.
And that was big for somebody going off to college, to have a high school teacher tell them that.
What a resource to have available.
Right. And then, of course, Vaughn Arney. Vaughn Arney directed the choir at the Methodist Church, and if you were going to sing in his choirs in high school, you were probably also in the choir at the church. In the high school, we did the mixed choir and the girls choir freshman, sophomore year, and there was a select ensemble. I was in that. In the band, I started out playing clarinet in junior high, but I was not a prodigy by any stretch of the imagination. So I went into percussion and played the glockenspiel, and the cymbals were my specialty, or triangle.
Did you ever play in the city band?
I did not play in the city band. No, I preferred to go and sit and watch boyfriends play in the city band. So,
Makes sense.
so I was at the band concerts, but I didn't play in the city band. I was trying to think through the teachers if there was somebody else. I think those three would have to be the highlights. Being able to play in a band and pull something off and put a program together and perform it and have it work. Those were just great feelings at that
You
time.
recall, did you ever go back to Bob Morris with some work in college?
You know what? I did not. I had some problems with physics, a lot of problems with physics in college, but Dad always came up and helped get me through what I was needing to get through, but it just wouldn't stick. It wouldn't go on and go on and stay. But that was okay. That was okay. But I've always enjoyed math. Dad used to take me on surveys with him. And of course, we could run or hold. We would usually take the tape and walk to where he told us to walk, and then I'd see him doing the figures and adding up. And he had a beautiful handwriting. When he did his figures, you knew exactly what that number was. There was never a question as to whether it was a 4 or a 9. And I was always kind of fascinated by the printing that he did with the surveys and his numbers. And I remember one time catching him in a mathematical error. And you knew my dad.
Oh, yes.
It wasn't often that you could catch him in a mistake, let alone a mistake he had to admit to. But I was young, and there was somebody else there with us,
Oh, my.
and another adult.
Oh, my.
And of course, Dad was talking at the same time he was figuring, and normally it wouldn't have caused a problem, but I mentioned it to him. I don't know that he ever forgave me for that, but he was gracious at the time and took care of it, and at the time said something about children. And but I remembered that time. I never brought it up to him, but I remembered that time. Yeah. Yeah. So Dad had a favorite phrase, and it was usually he would ask me if I was writing a book. And of course that page always needed to be ripped out and thrown away, but that time he didn't use that phrase for me. He just said something about children. But through high school we took some trips with MYF, took some trips with Job's Daughters, so we got to do a little bit of traveling. Dad was working most of the time, but he thought it was important to try to get away for family vacations when we could. And I had an aunt and uncle in Sheridan, Wyoming, so a lot of our trips took us west. And that was Betty and Norman Spangler. And
Do you still have relatives in Wyoming?
Yes, I do. I have a cousin, Sharon, and she and her husband are in Sharon and Jim Bedard, and they are in Sheridan, Wyoming. And Uncle Norm passed away a couple years ago, and we lost Aunt Betty in '06. And so my aunts and uncles, as you know, are dwindling. I have Uncle Dean passed away, of course, just a couple days before Dad did, yeah. And Aunt Rosalie had died before him, and so we have Uncle Dale and Aunt Joanne, who we treasure. And I was kind of in a unique position among the cousins because my husband Dudley and I had motorhomes, and we like to travel, west. And so we often traveled with Aunt Joanne and Uncle Dale and Aunt Betty and Uncle Norm and their youngest daughter, Norma, and Ken Eberts. So I had a little different relationship to them from just visiting at family functions. And it was great. It was great. So fun.
You mentioned a guy named Dudley.
Dudley. Mm-hmm.
Where did he come into the picture?
Dudley was my high school sweetheart.
Really? Okay.
He moved to school. He moved to Marshall his freshman year. He was a year older than I. And we dated off and on through high school. And in later years, I had 4 children. And I was going through a divorce. And Dudley came back into my life. And we married and have been together now for 35 years this summer. And so when it was time to retire and downsize, Marshall was home for both of us. Dudley had lived in Fairfield, Illinois, but always felt like Marshall was his home. Those high school years are so
Didn't take
so
too
important.
much deciding then of where to end up.
No, it didn't. It didn't. And our children were scattered from Texas to California to Florida to Georgia, and so we thought, let's come home. I still have two sisters in the area, one in Decatur and one in Casey. And at that time, Dad was in the nursing home in Casey, and we had a lot of friends in Marshall, and just decided it would be nice to have a home place in Marshall. And so that's what we did. I moved to, when I graduated from high school, I went to Eastern for a year, and then was married in 1965. And lived various places, but really didn't have a career until I was back in Lawrence, Kansas. And talk just a little bit about what I did at that time, because the growing up in Marshall had a lot to do with what I was able to do in a career.
What did you major in college?
In college, I majored in human resources, and I always wanted to be a secretary. My goal all my life was to be a secretary. And that probably comes from helping out in Dad's office when the secretary would go on vacation. I got to sit in the courthouse and answer telephones and take notes for Dad, and he'd usually have some typing or some filing or something for me to do. And before that, when I was in grade school, Granddad and Grandmother, Fred and Beulah Huffington, of course Fred was superintendent of schools, and so they also had an office, so visiting the office and the library that they had for the bookmobile. The courthouse was near and dear to my heart, and being a secretary and being behind the typewriter and being able to handle things and make things work always seemed interesting to me. And then Mother was a secretary. Mother went to Rockford School, Elsie Cork, and she went to Rockford School of Business after she graduated from high school. And she was working at the courthouse when the war came. And they were looking for volunteers to go to Washington, D.C. to work in the Pentagon. And my mother was one of the women that volunteered. And so she worked in Washington for a couple of years till she got a telegram from Dad that said, come home, we're going to get married.
That'd do it.
And that was pretty much the way their lives went after that time. Dad said, we're going here, and Mother was packing the clothes or doing the washing and getting ready to pack again. And but
Your mother, Elsie Lou, is just such a delightful person. My
Thank
wife
you.
and I both always thought so much of her.
Thank you. She was very special, and as the grandchildren were in for the funeral, I was talking to some of them about Mother and about her time in Washington. Most of them didn't know that she had done that, and they kept saying, Grandmother did that? So it was good to kind of get that word out, that there was another side to her, but she was the consummate wife, wife and mother, and there wasn't a music concert that she missed. Dad often didn't make them on Sunday afternoon because Dad was working 5 and sometimes 6 days a week, and when he wasn't on roads, he was often in the fields. And so he didn't make many of those concerts, but Mother was there.
And my mother was your mother's teacher somewhere along the way.
Oh, she was.
She taught primarily in the one-room schools, and I don't know what school it was in.
Yeah.
And I was not aware of that, although I'd heard Mother mention your mother. And when my mother passed away, there was Jack and Elsie Lou on the receiving line, and she said, I just had to come here because she was one of my teachers.
Yeah, they had a lot of near and dear friends, and
I guess I kind of disrupted your channel. You were in school and planning college, and then you got married, and I interrupted you from there on.
that's okay. That's all right, because in chatting about that, I mentioned Fred and Beulah Huffington, but I hadn't mentioned Joe and Elsie Cork. And of course, they were huge in my growing up. Papa, as we called Joe, our grandfather, built steps across the fence. They lived just north of the high school. First Christian Church is located there. He built steps over the fence. So when we went from the school to their house for lunch, we didn't have to go all the way around that fence. We could just climb over the steps.
And as I recall, I lived up the street from that, and that house burned about 1945.
It did. And then they lived in a cottage behind and built that house.
Yeah.
Built the new house then themselves. And then when Garver Fraser bought it after their death, he moved it across the street and turned it on its side, so it's never been the same since that time. But in going through pictures, I found a picture of the house, and I said, I've been looking for a picture of that house. So that was good. But Grandma and Papa they were there. They were there for us, whatever we needed. If we needed to stay in town, we were going to be in town late, it was okay to spend the night. When we were little being 1950s, Dad bought one of the houses from Sears that you could build on a slab, and built just north of Grandma and Papa's house. They had a lot. They bought a lot up there, and it was one of the first houses that went in up there. I couldn't tell you now whether it's the second or the third house.
There's a 3 or 4
There's
right
3
there
or
in a
4.
row.
It may have been the first one, but I can't tell you that for sure. But many a day we would pull our wagon and walk over to Grandma's house. And Grandma said she would see us coming, and she said sometime during the day we'd get mad and we were going home, we weren't coming back. And we'd load all our toys up and the wagon would go back to the house. And she said pretty soon here you'd come back again. She was a great grandmother, and Papa was a great grandfather. There were rules, but there was so much love. And I would describe the love of God to children by remembering spending the night at Grandma and Papa's house. And we would take a bath, and Grandmother would stand over the big floor heater with a blanket. And after we had our pajamas on, we would run out, and she would wrap us in that warm blanket.
There was warmth from not only the blanket, though, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But when I would describe to children what the love of God was like, they could relate to being wrapped in a warm blanket.
Sure.
And I've never forgotten that. So I, of course, wanted to include them in this. When I was in high school, Papa had, they would always sell a horse at the fairgrounds. And it was always a mare that was with foal. And Papa bought it the first year. Well, she ended up not having babies. So he got to keep her another year. And that year, Star was born. And that was the horse then they had until both of their deaths. And it was a Shetland pony. And we grew up with Star, and Papa taught it tricks. And he took the horse to the fairgrounds and showed the tricks that he had taught that pony right before they sold the horse, which was Beauty, again for another year. But he taught that horse to play dead. He taught her to kneel. He taught her
My goodness.
lots of tricks, and he would harness her to a sleigh in the wintertime.
Oh, boy.
And we would go downtown to get the mail. Have to go to the pool hall to get the paper. They'd get the paper, and so that was always fun. And that was the farm. Grandma and Granddad had a farm out on the Clarksville Road as well, Huffington.
Yes.
But when I think about farm life and chickens and sheep and baby lambs and butchering, and I think of Grandma and Papa.
And you ask someone all of those things today, there's no contact with any of those things, hardly. At least the new generations.
Yeah. They would have a large strawberry field, and going too far.
No.
And on Memorial Day, yes, it would be Memorial Day, there were concrete pillars that led into their cinder drive off of 6th Street. And on those pillars would always be big boxes of fresh strawberries. Ooh. And they would sell strawberries, and people would come up the drive. And grandmother looked at every berry that went in that basket. And she said, I want the last berry that comes out of this basket to be as beautiful as the top berry. And they were. And I still remember Mother saying, I got so tired of dealing with the strawberries that always had bad spots on them.
Maybe that was a good one to eat, though.
Those were the good ones to eat, and those were the ones that made the jams and the jelly. And they provided the city of Marshall with beautiful, beautiful strawberries, and they'd always be big and so beautifully sweet. And in later years, grandmother started making peanut brittle. And she would make peanut brittle that would melt in your mouth. And she would sell it in coffee tins or in gallon jars.
Wow.
And
That's a
at
lot of
Christmas
peanut
time,
brittle.
that was a lot of peanut brittle. And at Christmas time, people would put orders in for peanut brittle. And she would sell peanut brittle. Weren't crawling through the garden then picking strawberries, but she was making peanut brittle. And wonderful memories of growing up. I was very fortunate to have all of my grandparents up until the time that I was married. And of course, Grandmother Huffington was the last to die, and she lived till 95. And so lots of wonderful memories. And as I was living away from home, I knew it was important to get back so the children knew their grandparents, but it wasn't like going across the fence at noon to have lunch, or knowing there was always a haven in the storm, although they never took sides against Mother and Dad. Never would they take sides, nor would I ever ask them to take sides. But there was always a hug when I needed one. And wonderful times. Okay, we'll go into adulthood. My job, other than being a wife and mother, which were the treasured ones, I started work at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. And I started as secretary in the history department.
Just what you wanted to do,
Yeah,
right?
I was going through a divorce. I knew I needed a job, and so I took the state exam and qualified for a couple of different positions. One, I could go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and at 5 I could leave it. And the other one, I would kind of be on call. And I knew I needed the 8 to 5 at that time in my life. That's what I needed to do. So in the interview, they asked me how I was at working with distractions. And I looked at the chairman and I said, I have 4 children.
That's a lot of distraction.
I don't know how to work without distractions. And so I began work as the receptionist in the history department in 1979, and stayed with the history department just about 5 years, which it seemed a lot longer than that, but I kind of grew up in the history department. I was receptionist for about a year and a half, and then an undergraduate secretary position became available, and I was promoted into that, and then office manager. And so within 5 years, I was office manager at the history department. And then the chair that had hired me into the history department became director of the Hall Center for the Humanities, which was a humanities center, but kind of a fledgling one trying to find its way. It began in 76, but in 84, which was the time I went over, they'd received a $3 million grant from the Hall Family Foundation. And so there was starting to be some money available, and most humanities programs didn't have money. Mm-hmm. And so that director had a secretary that told everybody that the letters, by the time they gave them to her, they should be perfect, so she could type them and there would be no corrections or no editing. And she had them all pretty well baffled, so he brought me in to supervise her. So I went over as assistant to the director of the Hall Center for the Humanities in 1984, and proceeded to supervise the staff.
And I know, Janet, that was long before the days of spell check.
Oh yes, yes, but there were computers, And there were memory typewriters. And at the time, about 3 months before he asked me to come over for that position or to apply for that position, of course you can't promise anything, you have to apply first. He told me that she wanted him to buy a memory typewriter. And I said, you're wasting your money. You need to buy a computer. They were just, we'd had one in the department maybe almost a year, and we were the first department to have one at the university in the college, and I learned how to use it, so I was teaching people how to use it. And the history department had their Vitas on computer long before the other departments did. And we would do the tests on computer, and we would... I still remember somebody who put a test on computer that, they just changed a few words every year, and then she didn't save the file. And I said, don't ever erase anything on a computer. Never erase anything on a computer. And but we did that, and he bought a memory typewriter, and just a couple of months down the road, he said, you were right, I should have just gone to a computer. But she wanted a memory typewriter, so she got what she wanted at that time. Well, she worked for us about a year while I was there, and then she found other opportunities. And but it was an interesting time at the center. When I went in, there were 2 full-time positions, a half-time director and a half-time assistant director, and probably 4 students working for the center.
And this was all at the university?
At the University of Kansas, in Lawrence,
right?
Kansas. Mm-hmm. And the Hall Center was one of the research centers. So what it did was it provided some public programming, bringing in various lectures, but it also provided programming for faculty to come together in interdisciplinary programs. So rather than the English department just doing its thing and the history department doing its thing and the Spanish department doing its thing, we would do things that tried to cross disciplines to get those faculty to talk to each other. So that if the history department, and I don't have a good example for you, but if a historian's doing research in one area, well, somebody in English may be kind of touching that area a little bit, and somebody in Spanish may be doing that as well. Well, once they started talking to each other, it kind of broadened their research. And so that was our job. Well, I mentioned the $3 million grant. Now, some of that was to bring in some and to appoint some distinguished professors in English and history, and I'll forget all of them. But there were 3 or 4 distinguished professors that we were to name, and did that within the departments, but then they worked closely with the Hall Center. But there was also some extra money for lectures.
Wow.
And for other things. So the director was somebody who wasn't afraid to take chances. I mentioned the humanities wasn't used to having money that was undesignated. So he kind of, when somebody came to him with an idea, he'd give him some seed money, let's see where it goes. The idea being that if you start developing this program, then you can apply for a grant from the federal government. National Endowment for the Humanities was the big place that we often went. And then perhaps get some grant money to make it bigger. But it would all be under the umbrella of the Hall Center. Well, a few years down the road, the money was dwindling, and things weren't happening quite the way we thought they should have happened. So that director ended his term. Another director came in, appointed halfway, and he was one of the first directors of the Center for Humanistic Studies, when there wasn't any money. That was when it was first started, and then it turned into the Hall Center with the Hall Grant. And he was a man by the name of Andrew Debicki, Debicki. He taught Spanish and Portuguese, and he had a love for junior faculty and for helping them shape their careers and learn the things they needed to learn and do the things they needed to do so they could get promoted. because there were certain things that you had to write, certain things. You needed to turn your dissertation into a book. And some faculty would kind of languish along, never getting those things done. Well, he would put them on a track and help them and work with them. He would, he had lunch one day, would have he didn't call it his cabinet, but would have lunch with several faculty members that he would just invite at random, and they would sit down and just kind of talk about what they'd like to do and things that they'd like to see the center do.
Just really listen to them then.
He did. And one of the things they came up with was, they said there's been a lot of changes in philosophy in terms of how they categorize different things. And somebody said, I'd like to have a mini course on philosophy, so you kind of bring the rest of us up on speed in terms of what you're doing now and what the department's doing. Well, for several years, we did a mini course for faculty. And there would be 5 or 6 presenting faculty members, and they would meet once a week. They would provide readings for everybody to do, and they did it. And these grew to over 125 at the time they finished.
My goodness.
And we did one on philosophy, we did one on architecture. We did one with history, because there were lots of new areas of history.
You mentioned you were starting with the history department. Did that help to bring along and instill your love of history?
No, my love of history, I'm sorry, Damien.
Started a long time before that, I realize.
No, it never quite got where it needed to be. I treasure my history, and I treasure the history, but to study history was never my forte, and it still is not my forte. But what the history department did, it was the biggest department, and it gained me a reputation for doing what I said I was going to do. And faculty came to me years and years later, and they would say, I wanted to share this with you because I knew you would care. And one of our faculty members, Philip Paladin, won the Big Lincoln Prize. And he eventually went to, I don't know if he was at the University of Illinois, but he had held a Lincoln chair at one time before his death. And when he won that Lincoln Prize, and I think it was $50,000 and a bust of Lincoln, so it was a major prize, he came to me and he said, you're one of the first people I'm telling because I knew you would care. And one of the things we did while I was at the center is we developed a place where faculty that had published books that year could display their books, and people could see what they had published. And we'd have just a few of them talk just a few minutes about what their book was like, or what it was about, or what they learned while they were writing their book. So recognizing those accomplishments of faculty, because departments didn't do a very good job of that. You know, there was always the jealousy that was going on, and we were able to share with those faculty members. We had an award that was presented for a book of year, and when that award was presented, the person that received the award always gave a lecture. Well, then we expanded that to a small dinner in their honor ahead of time. And I had a faculty member tell me that this was probably the greatest time in their career. And they felt most treasured at that dinner and at that time because people talked about them and about their work and what it meant to them. And we would include graduate students and then some special faculty around. And I like to think that was my contribution to the Hall Center, was trying to fix it so that faculty felt treasured in terms of what they were doing. At one time, the staff at the Hall Center, I mentioned we had 2 full-time faculty members. Well, it went down to one full-time staff member and a half-time director, and I was that full-time staff member. And things were pretty lean at the center, but Andrew Dubicki was the half-time director, and he served a year and then took a sabbatical for a year, which meant he was nowhere to be. He was in contact, but he was I think he was at North Carolina at that time. But he asked me to serve as acting director. And at that time, I did not have my bachelor's degree. I had a reputation among humanities faculty. And so we talked about how that would work. And I said I would need to have some faculty that I could go to because I knew I couldn't deal with somebody's scholarly work. It needed to be faculty members. And so he said, I've got that handled. I have a couple faculty members that will work as consultants for you. When you contact them and need them, they'll be available.
Wonderful.
And so I did that, and that worked. And so I served as acting director for 3 different directors after that time when they would go away.
Did you ever do any writing yourself?
I did not. But while he was gone that first year, I realized how important it was to me and how hard it was for me to tell him I did not have my degree. So the year I served as acting director for him, I got my degree.
Wonderful.
I went to used a Friends University human resource program. You met 4 hours a week, and you received some credit for actual work experience by writing papers. So I did a lot. Yeah, actually, I did do writing. I did a lot of writing in terms of how your work experience had helped you and what you had learned through that work experience. And then you had different coursework that you did through that. And there were papers, lots of papers due. But every Thursday night for a year, I drove to Kansas City. And but I got my degree, so I had my bachelor's in human resource management. We brought some interesting people in as lecturers, and probably my favorite was Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks wrote the Learning Tree. Mm-hmm. And he also was a photographer for Life magazine at the time of the war. You might remember the cover that had a cleaning woman standing with a mop in front of the American flag in the Oval Office. Mm-hmm. Those were some of the photographs that he took. But I got to spend, in his later years, he became an artist himself and composed music and just a real Renaissance man. He was from Wichita, Kansas originally. And I got to spend an entire day with him, entertaining him because he was going to be lecturing that night, but just taking him around and talking to him and talking to different groups. And, you know, he could have been... I've been with some faculty that it would not have been a pleasant experience, but it could not have been more wonderful to have been with him that day. So that's always a memory. Steve Allen was another one, spending some time with Steve Allen.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, he was just wonderful. Unfortunately, when people came to the Hall Center, they weren't gone long before they died, and we never quite knew what that was, whether it was just that we got them at the end of their careers or what. But Steve Allen, got to spend some time with him, and he was entertained us for an evening, and it was a wonderful.
You left him with some
program.
good memories then.
Definitely did. More than I would have had otherwise. But one of the things he shared with us was the archives for the early TV shows. And he said they were wonderful, and he said that was when humor was humor because of life events, not because it was bathroom humor or it was making fun of somebody else. Right. And he said, we talked to the archivist and found that those early TV shows, he got rid of because he ran out of room. And he said, so those things are lost. They're lost forever.
Terrible. And
so I've always had, you know, there was something in me that didn't want to get rid of something that really was important. So I guess in that way, that part of my love of history is there. You know, the physical that isn't recreated.
Even today, a rerun of something like I Love Lucy.
Right.
It's funny, it's humorous, and you know almost what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But you can really chuckle and laugh at, and I like those things much better than some of this stuff that's on now.
Well, now they're always making fun of somebody else, or somebody, and usually it's the dad, and or somebody else there has to be something going on that's not treating people in a good manner. So that was what I did. Eventually became executive director at the Hall Center, which meant I did the same thing. I took care of the administration of the center, but we received a second hall grant and several grants after that from different foundations in the area, and the Hall Center opened its own purpose-built building at the University of Kansas. I should go get you that and show you that. I will do that. Because I got to serve on the building committee.
Nice.
For that building, and we helped design it. And we took an old building that was designed as a steam building originally, and it had been used as a stable, been used as lots of things, but it had lots of arches. And
true recycling. Then.
True recycling. My son-in-law, who is an architect in Orlando, and I would like to tell you just a little bit about my children, but he had said when I took him around and showed him the different sites we were looking at, and he saw that building, and he said, "Mom, you have to use that building.
That's the one.
You have to use that building." And the head of architecture was the chair of our building committee, and we talked about it pretty much at length, and we ended up using that building, and it was beautiful. And they gave us all the people on the building committee, the construction company gave us a lithograph of the building, and I have mine that used to hang on a wall, but wall space was limited here, so we didn't do it. But that's what I did. I stepped down the year before they moved into the new building, but I was there during as they were getting ready to build, and the arthritis finally got the better of my wrist, and I was no longer able to live at the keyboard, and that's what you had to do.
Have you gone back to see that since?
I have gone back.
I'm sure you have.
And the year after they started, second year, we were, of course, still living in Lawrence at that time, and I was given the Friends Award of the Hall Center for the Humanities.
Wonderful.
And that was a pretty big deal. I was treated very well at my retirement. I think many faculty would have liked to have had the retirement that I had, but they gave me a huge reception and then a large dinner that evening, and I felt very loved by the faculty and staff that were there and the friends that were there.
It sounds like your accomplishments were certainly worth a reward and recognition.
It was a different twist because I wasn't faculty, and because I had a good link to the community. One of the things that we did there, one of the times while I was acting director, I had a couple of gentlemen approach me, Lynn Smith and Bob Mueller, and they approached me. They wanted to start an organization in the community for retired people.
Oh, great.
That could continue learning. So they wanted to have a link to the university at the same time they were a link to the community.
Wow.
And we didn't have that anyplace, but I knew one of the things the Hall Center lacked was an alumni. We had no place to go if we were trying to raise money or if we were just trying to get a program. I'd started a mailing list of people who had said, "I want to know about your program so that I can attend." And so we started that, and they came to me and asked if we would be interested in doing that. And I said, absolutely, but I have to clear it with a couple people first. So I talked to my advisors, and they thought it was a win-win proposition. How could we lose with this? And the chancellor was firmly behind it. I had a great chancellor at that time, Bob Hemingway, and he was very supportive of the Hall Center, and he was supportive of these two gentlemen getting this organization going. And so he became a very good friend of mine, and I could often would come up with an idea, and I'd send him an email after hours, and just seconds later an email would come back. He was still just S2. And but we just started this. You mentioned New Generation, and they named themselves the New Generation Society of Lawrence because they felt like they were the first generation, not only with the interest of continuing to learn, but the means to continue learning in their retirement years.
You're probably familiar with a book, or it's a publication called Where to Retire. And there's so many other publications that list all these towns and everything where you want to retire to. And so many of them are oriented towards places that have education.
That's right.
And where the retiree can still
That's
keep
right.
alive with what's going on in education.
That's right. In fact, this seed was planted by an article in one of the newspapers talking about retirement communities. And they had, these two gentlemen had a group of friends. They had graduated from the University of Kansas, and they had both moved back to Lawrence to be part of it. They had a huge group of friends that had also done the same thing. Not all of them were KU grads, so that wasn't a requirement. There was no age requirement. You didn't even have to have graduated from a university. You just had to have an interest in what we were doing, and you had to be willing to pay the dues. And it was all self-funded, so the programs that we did all had a fee associated with them. And the center never took any of that money. That money went to put forward new generation. Good. And at the end of the year, we would look toward it, and if there were any programming funds available that had not been spent, we donated them. So we were philanthropic wonderful. As well as educational. It's a wonderful organization.
Kept it going then too.
It did, and it's still going today.
Wonderful.
And that's really good. So that was a highlight, and then from that, when we started to launch the new building, we decided that we needed a friends group of the Hall Center for the Humanities, and so several members of New Generation provided a basis for our steering committee to form that friends group. And that friends group is upward now, I would say, over 200 members, and my numbers may be off there, but they provide close to $80,000 a year in unrestricted funds for the center. And those funds are used for travel grants for faculty. They're used for travel grants now for graduate students.
It's a wonderful resource to have.
It is. They fund fellowships for undergraduates now that can spend a semester or a year at the Hall Center. And one of the things they do is they bring in 5 lecturers a year, and those undergraduates provide the transportation for those faculty. Those speakers. They interview them so that they write articles, and they have the experience of doing that in their undergraduate years. So it really, it's really very nice. Really very nice. The Dole Institute for Public Policy is located at the University of Kansas.
Is that Dole?
Dole, Bob Dole.
Okay.
Dole Institute for Public Policy. And at the time they opened, the New Generation Society provided volunteers to give tours and help them get established. So we've been pretty close to that institute growing up too. I mentioned that I wanted to just mention my children. We have 4 children. Elise Price Linus and her husband John are in Dallas, Texas. And Elise was trained as an early childhood educator. And she has 3 children, and she is homeschooling. And her first just finished his first year at Patrick Henry University, Brian. And then they have Ellie, who's 10, and Matthew, who's 5. So they're raising children in the Dallas area. And Elise just spent 3 weeks in Marshall, and she loves Marshall. She spends as much time here as she can, and usually tries to come back in the summertime. And she did when her grandparents were alive as well. So her children know the extended family. And they often looked around, since they were just here 3 weeks, they would look around, they would say, "This is all my family." And of course, living so far away from family, so that's very important.
Probably.
It does. It does. And then our second is Regina Price Turner and her husband Levi, and they're in the Atlanta area. They also have 3 children, and their oldest, Kirsten, just graduated from Lipscomb University in Nashville. Thank you, Dudley. In Nashville, Texas, and she's working in Atlanta now.
So where is it they live?
Nashville.
They live in Atlanta, in actual Lawrenceville, is the name of the community. But so she's working in her field of which is social media, and so she's working there. And Jackson just finished his first year at Harding, in and Searcy, Arkansas, and Cayman is 16. And so they are all home now for the summer, and the two younger ones, yes, the two younger ones are working, and so Regina homeschooled her children as well, all the way through. She said because Kirsten was the oldest grandchild, and she said when she first started learning things, just at 3 or 4, she said, I thought, why would I want somebody else to see the sparkle in her eye as she discovered things? And she said, I just decided I wanted to be there for those moments. And so that's been wonderful. And then our son John is in the state of Washington right now. And John has had a real struggle has had some mental problems. And so he lives on the streets. He still tries to stay in touch occasionally. But he's the one in addition to the others that we continue to pray for.
Sure.
That at some time he will be able to be back with us again. And then our youngest, Kimberly Drake, is in Orlando, and her husband John. They have 3 sons, and they range in age from 10 to 2, and they are homeschooling as well. Julian was in 1st grade when Kimberly decided. She called me one day and she said, John thinks we should homeschool our kids. What do you think? Well, I knew that secretly that had been a dream of Kimberly's, but her husband always talked about his children going to the best schools, and they were in private schools in Orlando, and she never thought it was a possibility, so she just put that away, and suddenly she was getting a little freaked out by this. So we visited a little bit, and this was October, and she said, or October or November, and she said, I think we'll start it in September. And I said, no, you won't. And she said, why not? And I said, you're already dissatisfied with where they are. You're not going to leave them in there until June. And so in January they started homeschooling, and the boys have just blossomed. It's really became a good situation for them. All 3 girls homeschool a little differently, which is kind of interesting. But they all visit occasionally on how they're doing, and none of them just stick rigidly to one way or the other. And the children have been able to grow in the best ways for them. John and Kimberly are the ones that have gotten us involved in a program called Africa Windmill Studies. Africa Windmill program. John went on a mission trip, and I'll tell you this because I think this is important. He went on a mission trip to Africa, to Malawi, with his church. And at that time, the church was participating in an AIDS program, trying to get AIDS vaccines to people. And they were doing it through health clinics, and it just didn't seem to be working. And the minister said, John, I like the way you look at problems, and I like the way you tackle problems and think them through. And he said, I'd just like for you to go spend 10 days on this mission trip, talk to everybody and anybody you can talk to, and then we'll talk afterwards. Let's find out what we need to be doing in Africa. So John is an architect by trade. He and Kimberly both graduated from Texas Tech. And so John did this. And he said, everybody I talked to said, we need a better food supply, and we need medical resources. Or we need water. That's what they said. And so John came home and had talked to the minister, and he said, just give me a little bit of time, let me think about this. So he started thinking of how people could have a better food supply and how they could have more water. They were already farming, but they were farming and trying to irrigate by buckets. Most of them had malaria. A lot of them had HIV. You can't water much of a garden with buckets when you've got to carry it. but their water table was very high. So he started thinking of what he could do. They were using hand dug wells. So it didn't take much to get the water up. It just needed to get out. So he started thinking of windmills. And he designed a windmill that could be made with found materials. So they didn't have to buy anything. They would make it themselves, so if it broke, they knew how to fix it.
That's the key.
That's the key. And he said when he visited, he would see the borehole wells that were just sitting there, not working. Because with the air, things, bolts get rusty or something breaks off, or they had no knowledge of it. So in Africa, they would say it had lost its white man's magic. And he said, I was committed that anything we did, we had to teach Malawians to teach other Malawians. So it wasn't white man's magic. And he found a gentleman who had been working with missions in Malawi, and he wanted to make Malawi his home. He had a love for the Malawian people, had a degree from Washington University in Washington, and he understood what John was talking about. And John said, he's almost there before I am. And so he became the in-country director of this not-for-profit called Africa Windmill Program. It's AWP. It's got its own website now. But so, of course, Kimberly right away had to start researching not-for-profits, because if they found grants, they needed to be able to funnel it through a not-for-profit. And she said, Mom, you would be surprised by the number of people that contacted me that told me how much money we could make by forming a not-for-profit. And she said, we don't want money. We just want the people of Africa to be able to grow their own food. Well, now those people most of them have quadrupled their gardens.
Oh, man.
They started agriculture clubs with the assistance of the chief of each village, and they would start with 10 or 11 farmers that agreed to meet once a week on this. We would teach them how to prepare their land for irrigation. I mean, I will give you their year-end letter because I think you just would be interested in this program. And when I was in Florida, just the beginning of May, for a few days, in one day, John had a meeting with people about 4 different countries wanting to implement this program. And they'll implement it by sending their people to Malawi to be trained, rather than recreating this organization everywhere. We pay a full-time director. There are 15 or 16 people in Malawi now that are working for Africa Windmill Studies program. Not full-time, but they help in training others. One farmer, the first one who said, I think this can work. I'll try it. Because, you've got to have one person that does it so others can see it's working. And he now, when John and Kimberly took their children and went back last summer, at their expense, always at their expense. I mean, they're very fastidious about making sure that they are not profiting from this. And they went to visit this one village, and the farmer was showing them his gardens, which had quadrupled, that the people from the village market now come to him to buy their produce, so he doesn't even have to truck it. And trucking it is, they have paths. They don't have roads. They don't have trucks. They may have a bicycle with a cart behind it. And he has been able to put a tin roof on his home and on his brother's home. And he's now putting a tin roof on his son's home.
Which is raising the whole standard of living.
Absolutely.
Really.
And John asked him at the time if all of his children helped in the gardens. And he said, only those who are not in school. Education is huge for the people of Africa. Huge. And they will send their children wherever they can to get educated, which often means, you know, they may be home on the weekends and may not be. But he had, and Kimberly said, well, I noticed there's a pile of bricks here in the village. What's that? And they said, he kind of leaned back and smiled and said, the Minister of Education has said, we will have our school to get our bricks ready. So this next year they will have their own school.
Wonderful.
So it's really, I mean, just that village, it's really done so much, not just in that family.
I've heard that the soil is very fertile, and you say adding the water to it will just make
Right.
the production tremendous. Is that an area where they've had trouble though with sanitation, or did he mention
Well,
that?
the water that they're using is hand dug wells,
Yes.
so it's not good drinking water.
Okay.
But it's what they were using to grow their crops with.
Okay.
And they're able to, they know the importance of boiling the water. And they're learning. And as our opinions are valued in farming, which they knew something about, then they came to us and they said, okay, but we're still getting sick. Then you can talk to them about water sanitation.
Okay.
And they've actually designed a solar sanitation that each home could do and could make their own. So that problem isn't fixed yet, but the problem of nutrition is being fixed. You can give somebody AIDS vaccine that has HIV virus, but if they're malnourished, it doesn't do any good because there's no protein in the body to attach itself to. So I'm going to give you one of those reports as I'm thinking about it now, because it's
Janet, in their travels over there, have they had any feeling of security or problems with the safety?
the beauty of Malawi is that they have no natural resources. Nobody wants them.
Okay.
So that was my aunt. When I asked John, he said, well, we don't have those problems in Malawi. Now, some of the other countries they're going to be using and they're going to be working with, they're beginning a program in Tanzania. And the church in Tanzania has asked them to come and do something and help them. There was a woman living in, you can read that at your leisure just because I thought you would be interested in it.
Sure, thank you.
She had met a student that was training to be a priest, and an Anglican, I believe, is the church, and they'd just become friends with them. Well, as he was getting ready to return,
Thank you.
they asked him to become the bishop for that church. I mean, now this is somebody that's just now, I mean, that's how badly they were needing somebody there, but they have a church there. And so she was trying to find a way to help them in Tanzania. What could she do to help the people in Tanzania? So she started reading and researching everything she could about programs in Africa and found Africa Windmill Studies. She lives in the same community John and Kimberly live in. So she contacted them. So they're working with them. So Africa Windmill is going to actually fund digging 2 borehole wells that will be located on the grounds of the church. The church will undertake the expense of keeping them running and also assuring themselves that nobody moves in to charge for the water. There's one borehole well that's, I don't know if it's 10 or 15 miles from town, but somebody moved in and charges for the water. Well, most people don't have a way of paying for the water. And they're collecting water in mud holes.
That's what I'd
On their
seen pictures of.
website, there's a video that shows, trying to get water, and the wells that they do have are much deeper than the ones in Malawi because the water table is not as high, and huge holes, and you see people standing just on the edge of those holes, letting buckets down and having to pull buckets up. And every year, it's not unusual to lose 1 or 2 people that fall into the well.
Sure.
So they've done that, and we asked John if they were able, if the windmills they were making and the water pumps were capable of pulling the water up that deep, and he said not yet, but we're working on it. It will be. And so, you know, it's an interesting story of development and how they got to where they are. I mentioned Texas Tech for John and Kimberly, so I really ought to mention Abilene Christian for Levi and Regina, and University of Kansas for Elise and John. They've all gotten their degrees, and so they're working and thriving, and we're enjoying them as well as our 9
You can
grandchildren.
certainly be very proud of the accomplishments, especially something like this windmill project.
Yes,
That really
yes.
is an improvement for civilization of a country.
Right. And so I felt that was important to do that. At the time we decided that we were going to downsize in Lawrence, I was in the middle of a migraine one night, and I just asked myself, where is it you want to be as you get older? And we'd been spending winters in Florida and had talked a little bit about moving there full time, but that didn't really appeal to us. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, I want to be in Marshall. So I began the selling process, which didn't take a whole lot to my husband. And that was in the summer, and we came home for Fall Festival that year, and that would have been 2012, when we started talking about that, fall of 2012. And he announced at the Fall Festival that year that we were moving back to Marshall. And suddenly it was real. So we knew what we had to do was first go home and put our house up for sale, thinking, oh, that'll be a year or two. Mm-mm. 6 weeks later, our house was sold. Ooh. And we were moving
now what do we
to
do?
Marshall. Well, Dad was in the nursing home, so we knew we at least had a roof over our heads until we could find a home. And I'd already scoped out some houses a little bit without Dudley, and I took him through some of those.
So you actually moved here then in 2013?
In December of 2012.
Or 12? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it was within 3 months we were here. And so we looked around and ultimately walked in the front door of this house and just fell in love with it and just thought this was just perfect. It's perfect. Downsized by 2/3. So, needless to say, a lot of our furniture, which we had collected through the years because we loved antiques, there's that history thing getting back in there again. But so a lot of the oak furniture went to the children, and they had grown up with it and they loved it, and so we're here. And as I think about collecting again, and we look at each other and say, if something comes in, something else has got to go out. So, but we're enjoying our time back in Marshall and being closer to family. And of course, with Dad's death, it was very helpful to me to be living in the same community and in close proximity to my sisters, and not having to make the traveling from Lawrence to be here at those crucial times. And we both have felt that, and while living 2 blocks away from Dad's house is hard at times, it's comforting at the same time. To know that we're here. And
you've had a wonderful, interesting background. Have you ever looked back and said, gosh, I wish I had done something?
You know what? I haven't.
Okay. I just wanted
as I think about and I talked about that growing up in Marshall helped my career. At the time I retired, at this beautiful dinner they gave me, they asked me to give a speech. And my speech consisted of thank yous. And it was thanking the people that helped me along with my career by teaching me different things. But I would not have been there I really don't believe I would have been there if it had not been for my background in Marshall. Mm-hmm. I knew that it was okay to serve. I knew that that was a valued role. You didn't have to be the star, but you could serve and help make things happen. And I was actually having a conversation with Dad long before we had moved back. And he said, he said, as I think about our families, I am very happy with the fact that we all did something in public service. It was school teachers, it was nurses, it was working in the education system, it was working as county highway we all did something in public service. And he said, I thought that was very special. And I think that's what my career's been based on. I think that's why I had the success I had. People knew I could get things done. They knew that if they came to me, the answer would be, I'll see what I can do, rather than no. Even if it didn't fit in the box. Dad's whole career was there. As I read through his oral history, talked about some of the things that he got accomplished for Clark County, and I think it went back as well to his history in the Seabees, the can-do attitude. The attitude that if you need something, you tell me you need it, and I'll do everything I can to help you get it. If it's not immoral or illegal, we'll try to get it done, And most things can be tackled that way. And I find that people are more responsive that way than if you say, nope, can't do it. And at the university, I quickly learned the people to go to that I knew wouldn't say no. They would say, well, let's think about this and see how we can make this work. All in the approach.
Like the right people and the right approach, there's a way to get things.
That's right.
Accomplished.
That's right.
Is there a particular historical event or something that's happened over your lifetime that you said, wow, that really changed my life, changed my pattern or thoughts on things?
I'll answer that question in a minute. I did want to mention, because I've mentioned the First United Methodist Church in there, when Dudley and I came back to town, we are attending the First Christian Church, which is located where Grandma and Papa's house was. Mm-hmm. But through the years we had changed affiliation, so I just thought I should add that in there. A historical event. You know what, I think, and I have been giving it a lot of thought, when my mother died, actually when she came back and was at the nursing home full time, my dad's life changed. And it changed, in fact, from just doing the things he wanted to do every day to being at that nursing home every day. And when she died, he turned another corner. He never looked back at the I wishes. He was always looking ahead to now and on. And it was like, you do the best that you can do with what you have at the time. And when that time is over, you keep going forward and doing the best with what you have at the time, instead of looking back with regrets or looking back to try to change something that can't be changed anyway. You're thankful for what you had in the past, but at the same time now you're ready, and a term that sometimes we like it and sometimes we don't, it's the new normal. It's the new normal. And it's a way of beginning to deal with your life and live your life in where you are now, rather than in the past. It's probably why he lived to almost 95 years old.
Great philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question I usually ask most people. I've got some interesting answers. We look around and we've got all kinds of mechanical and wonderful appliances. Is there a particular invention or something that you said, that just is something I could not live without, and here's why?
I think the washing machine.
I've had a few
I think
say
the
that.
washing machine. I think here, and I also think in Florida, we purchased a permanent or a home in Florida to be used for in the wintertime, but we have our own place down there now. And having a washing machine and the luxury of getting your clothes cleaned without standing there and doing it. Many of the days I was at Grandmother Quirk's on wash day, and never did it, but I would be with her as she was washing clothes and wringing them through the wringer and taking them out back to hang them on the lines, and then sprinkling them down and rolling them and sticking them in the refrigerator until she would iron.
Did she have a soda bottle with a cork and a sprinkler
Absolutely.
thing in the top to sprinkle?
Absolutely. And Granddad's work clothes, his gray shirts and pants that he used to work on the Pennsylvania Railroad, they would stand up by themselves when she was through. And I don't think he ever put anything on, even just when he was around the house, that wasn't starched. and so I think probably the washing machine. You know, it's just something, of course, you know, we all love electricity, but I could get along without a microwave if I had to get along without a microwave.
That's something that
You know.
a lot of people do mention. Oh,
Yeah.
I just couldn't live without the microwave.
Yeah, I could do that, but the washing machine, that's, you know, going to the laundromat, I mean, you know, we did that a couple times, but not my favorite thing to do. Yeah.
And sometimes people say the dishwasher too, but
Yeah. Well, in Florida, we don't have a dishwasher, so we learned we can get
survive
along
without
without that. Without that as
well,
well.
Janet, it's been a delight visiting with you.
Thank you,
And I
David.
appreciate your background. And I think this being in a part of our library,
Thank you.
there's going to be people that will listen to that and say, my goodness, that's interesting, or I didn't know that. And that's the whole idea, that this is there for people in the future
Yeah.
to see.
Yeah. Well, I think growing up in Marshall was huge. I haven't mentioned God directly as I went through this, but I did mention the love of God and knowing that that's what it feels like. And I have felt very loved and very cared for. Even at the time I was coming back and Carol was in the hospital and we knew she wasn't going to make it, a younger sister. I had a peace about me as I was driving from Lawrence, and I just felt like God was watching over us. And I've felt that my whole life. I've felt that my whole life, and been very grateful for that.
Well, you've had an interesting life. And again, I want to say thank you so much
Sure.
for your time and your hospitality this morning.
Well, thank you, and thank
And
you
we're
for coming
glad
over.
to have you as a part of our oral history project.
Thank you very much.